Hey there, Dango Stu here. Today's video is about continuing to remove stuff from the steel trawler in order to get it ready for sandblasting, and is proudly sponsored by marineengine.com. This video picks up straight after last week's video on doing the ultrasonic thickness testing, which was great news to see there's enough metal left there, particularly in the engine room. And while I had the needle gun out, I started continuing on the sides just to start removing some of the corrosion and the paint.
So it's coming alright, paint's coming off really easily. So I will then do a wet blast on here, but I think just getting the paint off with a needle gun means we're going to need to do a lot less time wet blasting and using less of the, the medium as a consumable. The great thing about this is it takes off quite big chunks. It doesn't sort of make a dust like sanding does, and because they're heavy and big, they fall straight down. So by having a tarp, I can just scoop it all up, tip it into a bin, and really keep the the environmental pollution down to an absolute minimum. I think as soon as you're sanding, you get a really fine powder and it just blows away on the wind and goes everywhere. So these big chips are pretty easy to contain. This is the thick crusty stuff that's so satisfying to needle gun off.
The needle gun is particularly quick at just getting paint off. You could definitely strip all the topsides paint off the boat in a day with the needle gun easily. It's also quite good environmentally because it doesn't make this fine dust that blows away in the breeze. You get to these heavy chunks that just drop to the ground, and that makes cleanup really easy. Where it doesn't win so well is in the noise factor. It is just incredibly loud, which is all well and good if you're in a huge boatyard and you're free to make as much noise as you want, but I'm not really in that situation. So I'm going to reserve the needle gun for heavy corrosion and maybe just some awkward places where I can't get like a scraper or anything else in. As an experiment, I've bought some professional paint stripper, which I'm going to try on the hull. I've also got some ingredients for doing some homemade paint stripper, so we'll try both of those as well. Then your other options are heat and blasting. So I'll pretty much experiment with all those techniques before this project's out. Okay, because I'm going to be blasting the inside of the hull as well, I'm going to push on now and start removing other internal fittings that are in the way, as well as the seacocks, because I'm going to be replacing those with new units. So, first step's just undoing all these bolts. Unfortunately, the nuts are on the bottom, so I'm going to have to try and spin the bolt using the impact gun and get a spanner on the bottom here. Once again, different size heads on the bolts. Okay. A rubber gasket. Actually looks in pretty good nick. Bit of a clean-up, it's probably reusable. It's quite soft still. We'll see. For the sake of a few bucks, probably worth replacing. Can't get the impact gun in under the flange here, so I'll just undo these ones by hand at the base and I'll pull the two parts off together. Easy to work outside the boat. This last bolt here is quite tricky because there's actually gussets down here that stop the spanner going in. The barrel of the valve stops a socket going in, but I've got the other three out now, which means I can kind of rotate the valve round and get to it that way. Okay, we'll clean all this corrosion up and treat it, and then I'll put a thread chaser through these threads and we'll grease them and get it all good to go again. A few oysters growing inside this valve. Not surprised I couldn't get it to move anymore. This, I believe, was a water outlet that came from the front of the engine, and over there is the water inlet. Some of the cooling water obviously goes inside the exhaust and then out through the wet exhaust. but it looks like the bulk actually goes through this outlet, which is below the waterline. I'm not quite sure whether it needs to be below the waterline, whether it could be up higher as an outlet. This could be one we can just seal off. If people know why it's done this way, let me know. And obviously I'll ask at the shop as well, see what their opinion is. Same thing with this one now. Just rotate it round, get to that last nut. The last skin fitting over here is the one that goes into the sea chest here. Then there's the Jabsco pump here that runs off the motor by a belt, and the outlet for that goes into the exhaust here. I'm going to take this pump out because it's incredibly rusty. It was hard up against the other water pipe, so it's not in a good position. The bracket's been welded on, it's very rusty, it was obviously never treated, and I really don't make any use of this currently. I'm not going to take the sea chest or any of the plumbing out at all, but what I may do is take this valve out, just put a cover plate. I presume that's an inlet for a deck wash or something like that. So I'm going to probably blank that off just to save a bit of money, take the pump out and the outlet off, and blank off the outlet on the exhaust there. I just kind of want it out of the way for now, and I'll have a think about what I'm going to do as a long-term solution once the boat's back in the water. I know it's going to be easier to deal with it now, but budget's tight and I can actually get to this part when the motor's in place, so that's okay. First thing I have to do is see if I can get this undone. If I can't get this undone, I'm not going to have a huge chance of getting the seacock out, so let's attack this first. This is overextended just to even vaguely get on, but I'm going to give it a few hits and see what happens. I'm going to need a bigger set of Stilsons and probably a bit of heat to get this undone, I think. So I'm going to leave this one in situ for now. I presume it's actually closed. I'll double check that from outside the hull. Alright, as usual, a little bit snookered now. I've gone on Friday and I went and bought the larger Stilson, so we'll get that other stuff undone next week. But quite often in this project I find I do just get stuck with something. I'll start something, it's not that I get bored with it, you know, I just get stuck, have to go and buy a tool or some consumables or whatever, and I'd rather group that into one large trip shopping wise rather than ducking up the shops all the time. So I decided just to push on and start cutting the old sounder housing off the side of the hull. There was a little bit of Sikaflex in this sounder box, and when I pulled it out, a bit of air rushed in, no water ran out, but I don't have a lot of faith in this anymore, and it's a pretty old school way of doing things. So I'm going to cut this off before I get the hull blasted so I can check the integrity of the hull below it. As I cut this open, you can see water's running out, so I'm glad I'm getting rid of it. It's obviously filled up with water, which is never good. Time to get rid of this completely and go to a more modern transducer. So, this panel's cut all the way around because it looks like there's a vertical panel here. So we'll get this out and see what we see. Alright, so you can see here, here's the hull continuing. So I'll get this out, and then we need to get a vertical cut up along here. And then this section's just full of water. It's tricky to get into here actually, so I might actually try and cut this base out first, because that section angles back and the body of the angle grinder doesn't fit in the gap. I could try and get the oxy torch in there. I actually did get it out and, you know, have a go with it, but I've got almost no experience with it. And what I was finding is, because I was trying to cut into the center of a bit of metal, I think the heat was dissipating too quickly, whereas when you start at an edge, you can sort of get your cut going. So maybe now I've got a chunk out, I'll find it easier to use the oxy, but initially I was finding I wasn't really getting it to get hot enough to cut. And I was also worried about burning the paint and everything on the inside of the boat. So I'll push on this way for now, see how we go. I did this first cut with the bigger angle grinder here. So the cut's quite thick and I can see through it, and I can see the other vertical members down here. You can actually see a bit of a weld mark along here as well. So I'm going to cut just forward of that first with a small one as well. Alright, it's
It's really hard to get in from the back there, so now it's bent down. I'm just going to try and cut this bit away from here, and then we'll cut up these sides. So it looks like there's a second bit of metal that comes along about this height. So I'm going to do a cut a bit above that, which will allow us to get this plate off, and we should be able to get a much better view of what's happening in here and make a strategy for getting the rest off. Yeah, so there's a double skid in here. I think I'll just start doing some cuts. Just get it away a bit of a time. This is the fitting that goes through the hole that we'll have to patch up. Although this may be a good location for a new sounder, so I'll do a little bit of homework there first before I patch it up, in case we replace this with a modern unit before it goes back in the water. Never know your luck in a big city. Oh, and don't worry, I've totally put the fire in the cabin out now. Of course, the downside to oxyacetylene is I've now run out of oxygen, so we're going to have to duck back to the store. I think I'll do that tomorrow though. Alright, now I'm going to clean this tube out so we can get the new stuffing box made. That looks heaps cleaner now. Now I'm going to spray a bit of phosphoric acid in here. Alright, here I've just got the phosphoric acid in a spray bottle, so because it sprays out wide, it should be pretty good for a tube like this. Alright, just use a rag to wipe up the excess, and then we'll let that sit for a while. I'm going to remove this cutlass bearing now because I'm going up to Parramatta today to look at getting the rudder post made, the stuffing box made, and new bearings for everything. So I'm just going to use a reciprocating saw to cut a sector out of it. Should make it much easier to remove. So you can see through here, goes up into the engine room, then this bearing's just pressed in at the end here. Going to try hitting it with a cold chisel now, see if we can break the bits up. Saves cranking up the compressor to get the air chisel. Up here is the retaining screw that I hadn't noticed in all the corrosion here. So I'll give this a wire brush. Unfortunately, it actually looks like a flathead screw of all things, which is not uncommon for a grub screw style. But we're going to have to get that out. I think once we get that out, it'll hammer out from the other side quite easily. Although those little flathead screws are quite stuck, I couldn't get them out in the end. I did also head off and buy an impact screwdriver. I couldn't find my old one, so I've got a new one of those, and hopefully that'll get them out. When I replace them, I'll put something in that's better than what was there. I'll have something with either a recessed Allen key or a proper hex header or something like that. I did, however, get about 2/3 of the bearing out anyway, which gave me more than enough of the tube to take some internal measurements of the diameter. So I got those. Then I went up to DH Porter. I took the remains of the rudder post, the remains of the old stuffing box, the propeller shaft with the propeller still welded on the end. He's going to check the shaft and look at getting that propeller off and perhaps repairing the thread. We'll see how he goes. He's also going to be supplying all the bearings as well. So I feel like that's like a bit of a nice milestone too, where everything's now in his hands. When they're all done, I'll go and pick them up, and hopefully by then we'll be ready to pretty much just start installing everything. So in the end, it was a little bit of a mixed bag week, but I've got some big jobs I want to do next week, but they need the welder, so I'm still waiting for my bigger welder to come back from the repair shop, so hopefully that'll come back next week. I could possibly do some of them with the little one, but I'd rather use the proper welder given their, you know, keel repairs, hull repairs, welding up the fuel tank, things that are reasonably critical that they're good welds. Alright, well until then, take care and I'll catch you next week. See ya.